Hello and welcome to the Growth Mindset Psychology Podcast with me, Sam Webster Harris, where we discuss the science of self-improvement and balance it out with the philosophy of what is a life well lived. I am delighted to be digging into listener questions again for our second Ask Me Anything, which you are totally invited to get involved with by joining the premium membership if you are interested. Today we have a fascinating range of questions from auditory processing difficulties, dealing with procrastination and accountability problems, the differences between low enthusiasm and a general negativity bias and what to do about either, my research and writing processes for the show, and what the hell is going on when we meet someone and we think of them one way and then they turn out to be completely different, and it really puts us off in a big way for some weird, strange reason. And yes, very cool questions, so thanks a lot everybody for your contributions. The first question we're kicking off with is from Monique, who I believe also had the first question in last month's AMA, so you can accuse me of favoritism, but that's how they appeared, I swear. Monique says that she helps kids with auditory sensory learning issues known as auditory processing disorder. And she also works with their parents with helping the kids. She got into this after realizing her own son had these issues and there was really low awareness or help for him at school. It's where the brain doesn't process sounds fast enough, leading to problems with any of the four domains of language: listening, speaking, reading, and writing. And her question then is, how do I think this affects their willingness to learn and what can be done about it? So firstly, that does sound like a very specific question about an issue that most people might not have heard about. But I think that it is a much bigger problem than people realize. If you look online, there are estimates anywhere between 1% and 5% of kids actually have this problem. And reading into the specifics of it, I definitely had this, /still do. That's not from a rush to diagnose myself with anything I hear about. That's because I 100% had this disorder as a child. And it is very common with people who have ADHD and can often also be misdiagnosed as dyslexia, which is what happened in my case. So definitely a surprising topic to find out about and dig into. Thank you very much. And if you haven't heard about it, I would say it is worth understanding, and I hope that's not from my own bias, but I'll dig into the common signs, why I think that I also have this, for answering the question directly. But firstly, the other good thing about this question is that in reality, basically all human beings will have some internal or external reason for a form of some learning impediment at some point in their life. Statistically, for example, half of the children who start school are younger than the older half of the kids in their year. When you are only 5 years old, that's actually quite a big percentage difference of how developed you are. Then some kids may have some trauma going on at home, or other problems like dyslexia or a difficulty with maths, or maybe they just fancy someone else in the class and don't concentrate for a whole year. So we all do suffer some setbacks. Some of them are more permanent, debilitating than others. So it's interesting to understand what will impact our willingness to learn going forwards. And in all aspects, the main drivers that block interest in learning will relate to social pressure of not wanting to look silly, which can prompt us to try harder and fight to get better, but more often than not, that prompts us to give up or disengage. And in all cases, willingness to learn relates to a need or interest in learning that skill and the availability of extra help to catch up. So it's great that you are out there, Monique, helping provide that extra support for people who need that with the auditory processing problem. And I'll talk about my own case and some common signs of auditory processing disorder. I really struggled learning to talk, and my older sister basically did all of the talking for me until I was 5 years old. And even now, when I'm at the dinner table with my family, I basically don't talk much, for example. After I did start talking as a child, I remained very shy and quiet for my entire childhood and still struggle to talk about myself in groups about things where I haven't prepared what I'm supposed to be talking about. I always suck at things like English, history, anything involving writing, as it felt like there was a big invisible wall around my mind. There was all these ideas inside my head, but unlike with maths where I could just simply write the ideas down that I was having, there was this giant disconnect between my thoughts and being able to write any words down or speak words. And then you have things like language classes, which I really couldn't hack at all. It felt like I just had no memory or way to conceptualize the new words that I was hearing. Every new lesson that I went to, I would feel anxious in that it felt I had to restart all over again, whereas other kids would seem to have this weird wizard-like ability to remember what they'd learned last week. And I did not have that at all. Another sign is that to this day, I am terrible at accents, which is often a common sign. And despite being good at music instrumentally or creatively writing music, I really struggle to pitch a note correctly. But it's not all terrible and woe is me, because of course, growth mindset. Things are still completely possible, even if they are more difficult. I lived in Mexico for a few months, and whilst I was there, I took on learning Spanish again, and this time completely immersed myself. I made a lot of time for it. I had daily private classes with a tutor, and unsurprisingly, within just a month, I could go out with Mexican people that couldn't speak English and be able to converse with them and understand most of what was going on and talk fairly coherently about things more in depth than just what I wanted to order for dinner, for example. And that was honestly something I thought would never happen as a child. Despite my years of Spanish class at school where I failed to learn much of anything, the time in Mexico really proved to me that I'm not terrible at languages as such. It's just harder for me. Ultimately, if you can learn one word, you can learn 10,000 words and a whole language. It just takes a bit more time. And this leads us back to the original question of, will an auditory processing difficulty affect a child's willingness to learn? And the simple answer is yes, it will be, because it will be much more difficult for them in classes that involve talking, writing, or languages. They'll probably find much more joy pursuing other things like maths, physical things like art, woodwork, or sports that will come much more naturally to them. The difficulties that they face can create a lot of frustration and anxiety. And I vividly remember how embarrassing it felt to be in a language class when I already hated being the center of attention because I was so shy, and then being called up to speak in class a bunch of words that I couldn't remember, I couldn't pronounce them, and I was constantly confused and left behind. And when you feel that incompetent, you do lose some motivation. So what's crucial for willingness to learn is the environment, teachers, parents, and other children. Your social environment is so huge. If you're made to feel stupid as a child, it's a bad experience. But if the classroom is supportive, inclusive, where it is encouraged to be taking risks and asking for help, that can really help improve your willingness to learn. And I did have some language teachers that I felt much more comfortable around and enjoyed the process, where there were other language classes that I really hated. So the teacher honestly made a big difference. And the reason I chose to take Spanish as the language that I did was because I had a teacher who was so fun, whereas my German, French, and Latin classes were not inspiring in the slightest. One thing that teachers can do is really recognize the difficulties and use more visual aids. Written instructions and positive encouragement can make a huge, huge difference. Generally speaking, the whole concept of what type of learner are you, auditory visual, is a bit more of a myth than people like to think. But in the case of auditory learning difficulties, it's not a myth, and things that are written down and things that can be visually explained are really, really useful. Then when it comes to parents, if they can understand the needs of the child and be encouraging without overwhelming them, provide them with extra resources or tutoring or ways that are interesting and engaging and helpful for the child so that they are still making progress, that can make a huge world of difference. And there are so many things that we're taught at school in a boring way, but could be more fun. For example, I had piano lessons, but I was taught just classical music, and I got so bored of it after a few years, it stopped. But then when I took guitar, I was just allowed to play whatever songs interested me. And I got much further, and it could be the same for art. At school, you might often be taught to recreate different classical forms of painting or something that if you love art, you might enjoy. But if you don't, you might find a lot more fun learning to draw your favorite style of cartoon. And the same principle can happen with language. Maybe you don't want to drill all the different verb types, and perhaps it's better to learn some stupid phrases and jokes. There are apps now that teach you to learn languages using popular songs that speak in that language. And I think there's a lot more availability of these type of tools around for us these days. So think creatively, and I'm pretty sure you can come up with a more fun way to engage a child with the thing they find difficult. Something I started doing when I was 25 to help improve my clarity of speaking was I would watch YouTube videos of karaoke rap songs, and I'd go for walks and I'd try and keep up with these fast-paced rap songs where I'd have to rap along to the whole thing. I found that really difficult because there's lots of tongue twisters and things, but I also found it really fun and engaging to try and get it all correct, try and see how much of it I could remember. It really helped work on very important fundamental skills within my brain of how I process movements in my mouth, how I understand sounds and how to make them. And it was so fun. And no one told me to do that as a child. And I would have had such better speaking if I had done that. So there are definitely ways to overcome these problems and increase the willingness to learn by making them more fun. Okay. And in case you've been listening to this and think that perhaps you, your child, or someone you know does have some of these issues, some other symptoms to look out for is these children often look like they might have hearing difficulties. And my mum, for example, took me to the doctors several times to get my ears tested because she was worried that I just didn't seem to hear things always. But during the tests, my hearing was clearly perfect. It's just that I wasn't able to make connections with the words that were being spoken to me. And it's because of this that sometimes these kids can appear slow, because it takes them so much time to process spoken words before they can work out what was actually said. And sometimes they just don't bother trying because they're like, oh, it'll probably work out. Or someone will come and make a point if I actually needed to hear what was being said. So you can just disengage. Another thing is they will often have a poor auditory memory for verbal instructions and forget them. And they really need to have them written down. If anyone ever tries to tell me a list of things to do, I'm like, why are you telling me a list? If I haven't got a pen and paper, there's no point telling me something because I will forget it. If I'm in a meeting, I make notes all the time because nothing will be remembered if I'm not making notes. I don't even need to go back and look at the notes. It's just that I need to read the written version of what is being said to me for it to actually enter my brain. Another thing is they'll have difficulty distinguishing between similar sounding words or phonemes or phonemes. I've never worked out how to say that word and I'm not going to bother now. Anyway, an example of this is I had absolutely no clue there was a difference between the word deaf for people that can't hear and death for people that are dying. And I genuinely didn't know it until I was 20. Something I mistook all the time was how to say car park. I honestly couldn't do it. It was always park car or car park. And those are the kind of mistakes that kids make a lot when they're 2 or 3, but carried on for quite a few more years afterwards. And you'll notice in general, they'll have difficulty with pronunciation or finding the right words. And that can lead to a lot of hesitation or occasionally completely incorrect words. I can't tell you how many times I've just brain farted the wrong word or wrong noise into a sentence. And I'll then be unsure of whether I just go back and correct the mistake I've made or just accept that I'm coming across like I can't speak properly. It's sort of in the same way that if you're in a wheelchair, there's an unspoken conversation of, do I acknowledge that I'm in a wheelchair or not? And it's a curious experience. Another problem, noisy environments can really suck. To this day, I find it very stressful having a conversation in a noisy pub when other people seem to be just fine. And I can't handle having a TV on in the background at the same time as when you're having dinner. It blows my brain that people do this. And I think this is partly the auditory issues and also ADHD, because why would you have multiple things to concentrate on? Yeah, really not good for kids or adults with this problem. Some common misdiagnoses is that people often mistake auditory processing difficulties with dyslexia because it has a lot of similarities, but it is different. And also often commonly occurs at the same time as ADD or ADHD, which again, totally happened to me, but wasn't diagnosed because often they can be very shy kids or afraid of talking, which means it often just doesn't get noticed much that their attention is all over the place because they aren't verbalizing their thoughts. they're less likely to cause a scene, and instead they might come across as a daydreamer. So yes, got a bit into the details there, but I found it really fascinating for myself and hopefully for people who have maybe seen this around them. I certainly remember other kids at school that did have this problem and it was just never spoken about or thought about. The good news is it doesn't actually affect any underlying intelligence, and if you spot it and know how to deal with it, it can be much less of a problem and kids will still enjoy learning if you make it fun. Okay, that was a bit of a long answer. On to a shorter question and answer this time, I swear. But firstly, a short break for advertisers. This one from Jason in response to my episode about 7 weird skills to change your life. He has since been working on his enthusiasm. He's found that to maintain a good outlook, he finds writing things down, vocally saying what he's looking forward to is genuinely helpful. That's cool to know, Jason. Thanks. He's realized that one of the big issues from when he was younger was lacking work ethic and lack of enthusiasm to work. Because after all, the heart of work ethic is enthusiasm. If you're not looking forward to the day, you're not going to enjoy it at all. And this got him wondering, if someone is unenthusiastic, is that equivalent to having a negativity bias? So, thank you, Jason. That is a really interesting nuance to dig into and not a stupid question at all. My first impulse was to say that yes, they are entirely the same thing. And then I did have to forcibly slow myself down, bring some rational thinking online to work out why actually they're completely different things, and it is very useful to understand the difference. So here are some hypothetical examples for you. Imagine a dude called Ryan starts his own business selling handmade candles. Initially, super passionate, energized for what he's doing, loves the craft, works tirelessly to build his brand. A year later, however, Ryan starts to feel unmotivated. His business is actually making money, but he doesn't feel the same excitement for work. Some of the orders he gets feels like a chore. He finds himself avoiding new projects, even though he does have the potential to expand. Ryan is unenthusiastic, and this could stem from burnout, maybe a feeling of stagnation. He's just no longer excited about the day-to-day operations, even though his business is successful. It's not negativity, but there is apathy. Conversely, let's imagine someone called Sophia. She works as a project manager at a tech company. She's very skilled at her job, generally gets along with her team. However, whenever something goes slightly wrong, like missing a deadline, receiving a minor critique from her boss, Sophia can spiral into negative thinking. She'll say things like, I'm not cut out for this. What if they decide to fire me because of one mistake? They hate me. Even on a day when she delivers a successful project and gets positive feedback from clients, she'll hone in and focus on the one piece of constructive criticism that she's received. Instead of enjoying her successes, she becomes consumed by her perceived failures. There's no lack of enthusiasm in her work, it's that she has a negativity bias. Her brain is wired to focus on what went wrong rather than what went right. So unpacking these, unenthusiasm is defined by lack of excitement, interest, or energy to approach tasks or life events. That can be to varieties of things like low motivation, exhaustion, physical exhaustion, depression, boredom, lack of personal connection to a task or situation, perhaps too much repetition. For example, if you've just eaten a whole pizza, you might be unenthusiastic about eating a second pizza. Doesn't mean you have a negative sentiment towards pizza, it means that you're full. However, a negativity bias is a psychological phenomenon where people focus on negative experiences and outcomes more than positive ones. And humans naturally have a negativity bias. This is to keep us alive. It means that we prefer to avoid risks over seeking rewards, and historically has been very useful for us. But it does mean that now in today's climate, we'll react much more adversely to losing $5 than we will gaining $5, for example. But for some people, this can be much worse, and they can see threats around every corner. They can see the bad side in anything, or they can overwhelmingly judge themselves when there's no reason to. People that have a higher negativity bias are more likely to dwell on problems and expect negative outcomes. They will focus on their flaws and find excuses for not doing things rather than thinking about their strengths or the positive outcomes that could arise. So putting this together, unenthusiastic people can simply be apathetic and indifferent, whereas those with a negativity bias will specifically focus on the negative aspects. They might even still engage in things, but will continuously fixate on the negative, and in fact, they might even overwork because of it. The really key difference is emotions. Unenthusiastic people will have very flat or neutral emotions, whereas negative people will often have very intense feelings. So having said all that, I should say, definitely there is some crossover, and I totally relate with why they might seem the same. If you expect things to be boring or pointless, that is a negative feeling. And if you're depressed or don't feel enthusiastic towards something, there is a general negative feeling towards your situation. However, I would say lack of enthusiasm is more defined by a lack of positivity rather than necessarily meaning you are negative, if that makes sense. And I think the differences are really important to work out for people. So I'm glad you asked the question, because if you're lacking enthusiasm, it might not always mean that you need to quit what you're doing. You might need to change something about it to spark that enthusiasm back into you. And sure, in some cases, it might mean that you should just have a big career change. But often it's worth investigating the reason for your low enthusiasm, and you might be able to fix those with a different strategy. And certainly worth the episode where I talk about how to build enthusiasm. But if your problem is an issue of being negative, that could of course be for legitimate reasons, like you're being treated badly at work or you are in the wrong career and you should be doing something about it. But it could be due to internal oversensitivity, which you can work on directly, but with different strategies to enthusiasm problems. And depending on the different scenarios that are causing you to be negative, a lot of this will be due to fear and past experiences. In trauma, you should be able to find ways that don't trigger you so much, or consider a lifestyle or job that doesn't involve so many triggers. But in some cases, this can be hard. If you have a job where you constantly have to put yourself into the line of being judged, there might be other jobs which are better for you. But if it's something like relationships where you find you always focus on the negative sides of things and are always looking for threats, that's going to be something you do genuinely need to work on yourself. And certainly some partners will be much more triggering than others. But it's good to know where you're maybe being irrational or catastrophizing yourself. The episode I've done on catastrophization is a really good one for that. But thanks for the question. Really interesting difference that wasn't instantly obvious, but good to clarify. Okay, next question from Francisca Borges or Borges. Accents aren't my strong point, and I'm learning Portuguese at the moment and have not nailed it. Sorry, Francisca. But anyway, you are asking if we can have an accountability channel, which I think I've already answered. And the answer is yes, we already now have one. So glad we've got that working. And for anyone else that's listening, we are starting to do 2 co-working sessions a week where anybody who wants to join can get on a Zoom call, share what they are working on, and then work on it. That could be writing, homework, tutorials, exercise, anything that you struggle to sit down and focus on when left to your own devices. So anybody in Premium that wants to get involved, jump into Discord to find out more details. Anyway, Francisca's question continues. In your last newsletter episode, you showed us a picture of how you break down a project into all its pieces, and I suppose dates, and then work towards completing them. I am having difficulty setting clear finishing dates for my tasks. Instead, I spend a lot of time panicking and procrastinating. Just for clarity here, I definitely spend lots of time panicking and procrastinating. If I gave the impression that that doesn't happen, that would be unclear communication on my part. Onwards, can you teach us how you do it, /get your show on the road, /share some resources like books or online websites that can help me delineate a plan for a project? Some things that I already know. You should break it down into really small tasks, so small they don't feel overwhelming. Also, sometimes goals aren't the best measure because they create too much pressure. It's better to create habits that help us get there. Well, thanks for the question, Francisca. There's a lot there that you already seem to know. But there is, of course, a big difference between knowing the big picture of things and understanding the underlying strategies to get there and different nuances that might work for different people. So I'm going to go through each point you've made in detail of exactly what worked for me and share any other points I feel might be missing. So firstly, how did I get the show on the road? This will be quite an interesting example because I started the podcast as an interview podcast, and it actually took me 8 months from recording my first interview to finally releasing an episode. The huge benefit of running an interview podcast is the accountability I felt I owed it to someone to release the episode. I had some very huge delays in editing. I had no idea what to do or where to start. The tools back then were terrible. I had to work out where I was going to publish things, what to call the show, and I had issues simply getting comfortable recording my own introductions to the episodes. So if it wasn't for the accountability of the fact that I'd sat with another human and recorded their story for an hour, my hypothetical podcast idea, I doubt, would have navigated all those roadblocks that I experienced at the time. Now, these days, it's much easier to start a podcast. There's many good recording tools, editing tools, hosting. There are free and readily available hosting tools that are really good. So there are certainly less barriers. But it's still interesting. Now, over the first few years, I did get into a flow as I was no longer learning new things and working out big problems. And I really enjoyed talking to people. And it was the fact that I owed them each an episode that I then had to release that really created a habit. By the time I'd finally edited over a month the episode I'd recorded, I'd already recorded 2 new ones with people because I was excited to record more. And so there was a constant flow of work I had to release. Then after 2 years, the show got to being big enough to start having advertisers, at which point I had to maintain a weekly schedule out of obligations. And I found this a bit stressful, but I put all of the income I made from it into paying an editor to help me, and I didn't make any money. And on average, every year, the podcast probably cost me something from that point. But instead, my output for this hobby was able to grow with it taking less admin and frustration time from me. But it was definitely the fact that I had external pressure that forced me to keep the show running and helped me to transform it to today, where it's more of a scripted and host-led production rather than interviews, that I doubt would have worked if I'd started it that way at the time. So essentially the answer here is accountability. Sure, I was very motivated. Yes, I worked really hard and obsessed about it, but showing up really required external accountability. And at the same time I started my podcast, I was also trying things out with writing that I totally didn't stick to. I was also doing music production that I totally didn't stick to, because in both cases I had no external accountability and was just randomly doing things when I became organized to make it happen, which wasn't very often. I know you've also mentioned that you want to become a copywriter and a writer in general. So I would honestly start looking for ways to just write for other people with a deadline. And in regards to any of your personal output, try and remove as many blockers as possible. So what worked best for me out of all the different writing strategies I've used was when I used a Notion-based website tool called super.so. And as soon as I finished writing an article in my Notion, I could just move that written article to a different folder within Notion, and suddenly it was already published. All I had to do was click one button and it would already be online. Now, no one ever really looked at that website and would know to find it. So instead, I moved to Substack because it instantly publishes to people's inboxes, and the Substack app, which has distribution built in. So I have got a few followers there now instead. But I do write half as much as I probably used to because there's just a little bit of friction between going from where I write it in Notion to copying it into Substack and formatting it, which does mean that I often never publish some of my writing because life. So definitely anything you can do to make the publishing experience as easy as possible, I would recommend. Then can you share some resources like books or websites that could help me delineate a plan? Yes, the book about the 12-week year, really good book on organizing your time more effectively. Okay, if you are hearing this, You are on the public free feed, and if you want to hear the rest of the episode where I finish the answer on how to go through procrastination blockers and meeting deadlines, as well as the other questions around how people can surprise us and why we misjudge people, and my personal writing and researching strategies for the episodes. If you do feel like joining Premium, you will also be able to contribute to asking me any of the questions, or join the Discord channel where we have the accountability sections and now the weekly co-working sessions. But regardless, the podcast will always stay free, so I hope you enjoyed it. And if you did learn anything useful in the episode so far, then do please share it with a friend who you think would like to know about it as well. And I do for now still have slots available on Wednesday afternoons for free calls with any listener. If you look in the description, you can find a booking link there if you do want to chat to me about something. And I do answer all my emails if you email growthmindsetpodcast@gmail.com. On that, there is a weekend to be had, so get amongst it, people. Remember, just as I say, you are what you eat, you are what you read. So I hope that you consume something interesting this weekend. And on that, stay awesome. Thank you so much for listening.
Go you!
Your consistency to reach the end of an episode is legendary.
My hero!
But when we learn things, it's important to reflect. So I politely invite you to take a pause, rifle through the biggest ideas you just heard. So here's your opportunity to hit pause and have a think. Okay, did you wrestle with some insights? Information doesn't stick when we race from one podcast to the next without using our brain to play with the knowledge. So here's another go at a pause. Alrighty, I'll let you off to continue with your life now. If you have any ideas or feedback for the show, I'm always interested to hear from you.
You're the best!
And other than that, please stay curious. Curious. Quote. Smiling for no reason.